Right, good evening, how are we, everyone? Just getting started here. We are going to be kicking off tonight, episode 15 of my Wednesday wine section, where we talk about some fascinating topic in wine that I came up with, and that hopefully you guys can get a sense of something interesting to learn, take away uh, from it. So tonight, we are in the harvest of grapes period in the northern hemisphere. Full bore here in California. We have reds, we have whites, we have pinks being harvested throughout the state. We're seeing the climate starting to get a little more into fall, so it's gonna keep slowing down the grapes to ripen for those bigger varieties, those Cabernets and some of the later season Pinot Noirs and other reds and maybe even the cooler climate whites, um, which will be nice to kind of um, spread out the peanut butter, as they say, to finish off this harvest. Yeah, and so as you get that fruit in, we have to ferment those grapes into wine. And there's a multitude of ways to do this. Obviously, there are yeast and bacteria free floating in the air, and a lot of natural slash higher end producers will utilize that really clean fruit that they have, and use the native strain or strains that are on those berries as they bring into the winery. There's also a little bit of a side effect of what's already in the winery that can affect, the microbial load of what is actually doing the fermentation. There are studies that have seen multiple strains can actually dominate that culture to finish that fermentation. But usually one strain usually prevails, because of some internal mechanisms it has to kind of kill off competition. Really cool organisms, those fungi, as they say. So I'm going to be not really talking about the native section of our um, of our area, but it's definitely an interesting aspect of using what's in the air to bring apart the quality and efforts that were put in from the vineyard aspect, and the amount of time and labor to create the most healthy fruit, which has some good quality yeast on there that you can then propagate on your own, versus using a cultured batch that you intentionally pitch in there. I've worked with both in my career at different places. I've seen native ferments work out great. I've seen them work out not so awesome. They can be very laggy and sticky. In the best cases scenarios, they do take a lot longer because you're starting with a very little population density, and you have the perfect environment to let them grow, but it does take time, especially when you're talking high-end Cabernet, high-end Chardonnay, high-end Pinot Noir. You have to you have to allow that population to multiply, and that can take a long time when you're starting with a very little amount per unit of fluid, and you need to basically get to around a couple hundred, or sorry, a couple million cells per milliliter, to have active fermentation, or the peak of your population density uh, to where they start just eating sugar faster and faster. And in the majority of the world, we would do this, for lack of a term, artificially, where we're going to take a cultured yeast that is developed in a lab for its particular properties. And I'll get into some different ranges of properties on yeast, because there are literally there are literally a yeast from almost any situation that we're going to see, uh, in the world, whether it's a white wine, whether it's a red wine, whether it's a rosé wine, whether it's uh, a white wine you want to have some more riper characteristics, or some white wine that you want to have some more linear mineral characteristics. Um, do you want some more floral attributes to it? There are literally yeast for almost any of these scenarios, and a lot of these are bred for having some of these natural attributes, and then they're even maximized in their breeding to elaborate that particular characteristic in which they are um, very, very good at. There are yeasts that are really, really alcohol tolerant. There's some that are very not. And then um, there are even other, um, excuse me, need to sneeze. And I'm back. There are different species of yeast that are well, I digress. I digress. I'm getting ahead of myself, as I normally do. One thing we should talk about to start off is who is doing this fermentation. So I think that's the most important part. And there's one primary species of fungus, yeast, that is doing the fermentation, and that's in breads, that's in beers, that's in materials that we're going to be distilled. Um, those that is the main culprit for all the fun beverages we get to partake in, and that is a yeast called Saccharomyces. And there's a Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the full Latin terminology name given to it, but Saccharomyces, or Sac, is a perfect um, halfway zone on uh, what we can call it. And with that particular species, there are many different strains, and those strains have these different properties, as I mentioned earlier. But there are other species of yeast and fungus that, wow, that doesn't turn on very long. There are different species of yeast that are don't have the same robust characteristics, but add interesting attributes to a wine if used in combination at certain points. Some sequential fermentations can happen where you want one specific yeast to ferment the first third or first fourth of the fermentation, and then it gets to a point where those yeast cannot live in that scenario because the alcohol is too high for them to tolerate. And then you have your other yeast, your Saccharomyces, take over in terms of the population density and complete that fermentation. And they can offer increased aromatics, increased mouthfeel, increased fruitiness or floralness, or increased there's many different combinations, so that's what makes it very interesting. Is some of these different species can offer very, very interesting attributes, but they can go sideways, which is the roll of the dice that you have to make when doing that. Same thing with the roll of the dice of going native and hoping and praying you have the perfect scenario that your native yeast will provide you everything you want from a complexity of aromatics and taste, but also that it won't struggle and have an issue to where you have to correct, or maybe that wine will turn out flawed in the long run. Um, that would be the worst case scenario, because if it's flawed, then you can't sell it. You can't sell it, you can't make money, and then you just shut yourself in the foot. And so a lot of winemakers won't take that risk. They want to at least know that what they're throwing in there will get the job done. It's perfectly adequate. And most of these native strains probably probably aren't that interesting in the long run, but they are more interesting from a naturality attribute, and potentially having a better cohesiveness with that fruit that it's growing on. But I would always think it'd be very interesting for high-end producers to play with that, play with pitching yeast, play with not, um, break the normalcy of what they think is proper and done right. There are many places out there that you could even consider. They'll pitch their first couple of fermentations with a cultured yeast and allow that to be their house native strain that is in the winery, that all other fermentations will have at least that backbone to it to proliferate in other fermentations due to the natural increases in the ambient conditions of that fermentation. Um, so those are all the choices you have to make up front to get started when you're talking about fermenting wine and beer and otherwise. Else, I don't think there's any beer guys or spirit guys that use native um, native attributes. One, because they're boiling everything out in the process of turning a grain into a sugar substrate to ferment. So you're sterilizing everything, so you have to pitch an inoculum in there. But I wonder if there's some ways to do a beer using a native strain from an extract or something. Might be interesting. Maybe come in on the hops and you get the natural hops yeast in there. Although hops would probably be very terrible carriers of yeast due to its attributes. Probably wouldn't live very well on them. All right, so now we kind of talk about the baseline of who's doing the fermentation. Now it's really the process of what's happening, because I think that's an interesting part of what is happening when you're taking this yeast and putting it into your sugary solution, your grape juice, and what are they doing? Well, and first off, there are a couple of different attributes to consider to have a healthy fermentation. One is you need a healthy enough amount of sugar in there for the yeast to fully consume it all before it gets to a point where the alcohol is so high that they become intolerant and then they die of their essential waste. And the ethanol is the yeast's waste. They eat sugar, and through pathways in their cellular structures, they take that sugar compound, they break it down through a multitude of different pathways um, to convert a glucose molecule, cleaving off two uh, uh, carbon dioxide molecules, and that leaves ethanol behind. Um, and there's a bunch of other pathways when it comes to taking that sugar molecule and being rearranged and split through different metabolic pathways to get pyruvate, then acetic acid, and acetaldehyde, I should say, and that in the absence of oxygen will then be further reduced down to ethanol. Can get really heady there, but basically, for the layman's terms, it's the easiest way to digest. Funny, pun intended. Um, Yeast eat sugar and shit alcohol and CO2. That's about it. Easy way to think about it. There's other attributes that are happening um, in and around that that help best maintain that. And yeast, like ourselves, they can't just eat just sugar. Like that'd just be like a human just eating rice. All I get is rice. They need the protein. They need the amino acids. They need um, a healthy amount of oxygen, like us, to properly build an army of other yeast to then best eat all that sugar, build a population density that would compete, eat up all that alcohol, or sorry, eat up all that sugar and convert it all to alcohol. And then when it's done, die. Sadly enough, they all must die. Um, and so they have their rice, they have their sugar, in their solution, and they also have their protein. They have their amino acids, much like us. There are some um, other attributes in terms of they need their vitamins and minerals like us. Um, they need some other nutrients in there as well to help give them a balanced diet so they can properly eat that sugar and not be stressed out, much like a human would be. They would see that just eating rice won't cover the bases, so you don't want your yeast to be diabetic, or you don't want them to have heart disease. Not that they have hearts, but just for a connection there to the human world. And then uh, in the other pathways of these healthy systems of sugar and amino acids and all the other fun micronutrients in there, much like we would need to have, um, these yeast will perform remarkably at eating that glucose substrate and making ethanol. On the side of all that, they are also being able to create esters and terpenes and use what's in the grape itself um, as as a base point to take some of these smaller molecules or precursor molecules to create um, everything we smell and taste in a wine that we enjoy. The fruitiness, the floralness. All of these are different chemical classes or components that can be um, unbound because they can be bound to a sugar. They can be a precursor that need the yeast pathway to create a that molecule which can be smelled. There are a multitude of different avenues for this to happen, most of which are beyond my comprehension at this point. I learned it at one point, but again, uh, the only thing we have to know and realize is what these yeasts can do and can't do. There are specific yeasts that are great at generating the grassiness of Sauvignon Blanc and producing more of that characteristic, these diol components. There are yeast strains that are very good at driving particular types of esters that can be known for more banana, pineapple, and very, very ripe uh, tropical characteristics versus other esters, which could be a little bit more citrusy and lemon lime. And then there are other yeasts that can be very good at using different pathways to create more floral attributes and increase that density of these floral characteristics in very terpenic varieties like muscats. And it's fairly remarkable how well they do at um, very little changes to what they are. They're still yeast. They're just cousins of themselves that have um, different attributes and characteristics, much like every human is a little bit better at something than another. Um, Not everyone can be a genius. Not everyone can be an architect. Not everyone can be a musician. So that's kind of the lens we're looking at this through is who's good at what and what do we need them for when it comes to creating uh, the right environment to create the best aromatic attributes for a different varietal, or maybe even a different style in that varietal, depending on where the fruit's coming from, depending on the style you're wishing it would go, um, depending on what you really think should happen in that fermentation. Oh, Live Laugh Lloyd, always coming in hard with some very broad questions I get to answer. You know what I think the best wine for all wine? It's Elegance. That's a proprietary name. But I know Mr. Live Laugh Lloyd definitely loves some Elegance. Um, and uh, I've seen it work well in whites and reds myself, so I really think I've seen it in rosé, but hell, we can give it a try. See what happens. I was actually on some websites from these yeast producers Yes, you are an elegant man. That's true. Um, and there are, I mean, the materials they put on, the research they do into driving these different strains, and they name them all fanciful names, but they all come back to a particular number or something like that. That is um, what can be very interesting about them. But a lot of them, what the major attribute that they're trying to provide is giving the winemakers the choices, the deviations, the paths that they can take for each fermentation. Do I want a fermentation that's going to be um, fully dominate the solution? I'm not going to have any issues. It's going to ferment vigorously. It's going to need a ton of extra nutrients to. Um, it's not going to need extra bunch of protein you got to throw at it to make sure it doesn't die mid work. Um, is it going to be healthy? Is it going to not throw off any bad attributes? There are those workhorse strains that are great at that for a reason. They are middle of the road. They get you to the endpoint well, that you don't have to think about it. They're not particularly um, interesting, but they do give the wine a fair shake at what's within that fruit when you harvest it, without pushing the wine in maybe a natural direction, versus some other strains that are very specific to a particular variety. There are particular Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blancs that are really designed to maximize the flavor characteristics of that. Sauvignon Blanc is one of them. Chardonnay. Um, there are more and more specific yeast for red wines, whether it's a Pinot Noir or a Zinfandel or a Cabernet, or even some of the other varieties like Shiraz give it more peppery attributes, more spicy attributes. Um, there's even now hybrid yeast that are taking um, other um, other species and combining and crossing them with that baseline Saccharomyces, and they're taking a Saccharomyces cerevisiae and another Saccharomyces species, um, Paradoxus, or what's the other one? Caraconus. These are way heavy. Saccharomyces euverum, um, Saccharomyces zevili, or what was that? Kundariviz. I can't even say it. But they're using these crosses to make some interesting um, new forms of yeast strains that can provide a different attribute, whether it's very alcohol tolerant, or it's produces a lot of one attribute much differently than another non-hybrid strain would provide. There's strains that can even see uh, alcohol tolerances to a point to where they can get up to like 16+% alcohol without a problem, for a white wine, or for any wine that's a wild world and can have full fermentation dry and get that much alcohol in it. There are um, strains that can really maximize floral components, that can be like 1.5 times the normal amount of floral characteristics that you can see in varieties like Riesling, or Pinot Grigio, and some of these other light, uh, delicate wines, or highly terpenic wines that can get to this really, really high level, that can be maybe a little too intense. I don't know, depending on what you're really looking for. Um, there are there are yeasts for really, really neutral, robust fermentations for sparkling wine production um, that are fast. They're create a ton of CO2 and then they die off and they're done so that they can um, be moved on to the next step of the process. I mean, there's literally a yeast for any situation these days, and I'm literally looking at one producer, and there's about three main places that produce yeast for the wine industry, and they all have their own versions of these, and that are patented versions that can get you to these points. So now you have your baseline. You understand what's happening. You're taking sugar, converting into ethanol, releasing CO2 in the process. You have your yeast strain that is selected to give you um, a particular attribute you're looking for, uh, and then throughout the process of fermentation, the biggest key is how you're going to affect the speed, the rate, the continued healthiness of um, that fermentation, and that's done through a multitude of things. One, by analytically checking um, and visually checking what's in the fermenter. So you're going to be looking at where you're starting from a total amount of soluble solid sugar in there, and then you're going to be watching that degrade day over day, sometimes even multiple times a day, depending on your system and your process. Um, and then you're going to be watching other attributes. You're going to watch that alcohol increase. You're going to be watching your volatile acidity or your vinegar component. You're going to be watching that, making sure that there's nothing wacky going on in there. You can smell it first off, but the analysis will give you that that um, that metric to follow and trace throughout the life of that wine. The more data you have, the better you can see what may be happening behind the scenes that maybe sometimes you can't particularly smell at every single point of that wine's life. And then as you get to the point where little sugar is remaining and your alcohol is getting to a point, you're checking to make sure that the last of the sugar is being consumed down to a point to where what is remaining will not cause a problem later in that wine's life. And different winemakers have different levels of where this is acceptable. For every standard still wine, that's not at a high alcohol percentage. If it's 11 to 14%, anything under 2 grams of sugar per liter of fluid would be considered bone dry. Some people will talk about less than 1. And at that point, you're down to a point of difficult analysis um, in terms of variance when you're testing in a lab scenario. And once you get to that point to where your sugars um, is completely chewed up and all your alcohol is and ethanol is produced, what's going to be happening is all those yeast that did all that work, they now get to die. Sadly, RIP. They will die, and then they will start to burst open from the cellular walls. They'll start to crack open, releasing all the fun proteins and bits of those of their bodies, their cell walls. And in and in different styles of wines, like a barrel fermented Chardonnay or something like Pinot Noir, you would use that sediment to incorporate into the wine post fermentation for a particular amount of time to increase the body and mouthfeel of a wine. And I've seen it used in all different sorts of red wines, white wines, rosés, sparkling bases, um, depending on what you want. You would allow some settling of that material. You would then transfer that wine off the heaviest bit of settlement, taking the light, fluffy stuff that would come with it, leaving all the heavy muck and mire behind. Um, and then as you mix and incorporate, that actually reminds me I need to set something up for work as I think about it, which is fun. Um, oh man, that's an old one. Holy moly. Um, there we go. So you have your light sediment post fermentation, which will naturally settle down due to gravity, and you can reincorporate that. You can reincorporate that. You can mix it back in. You can have intake mixers. You can have pumps that'll pump that and move that volume over. You can use inert gas. Um, okay, so you have that fermentation settling. Um, there are products that like that dead and dying yeast that you saved. There are products that are built to act exactly like them, but a purified form, which are very handy to use later in a wine's life um, to add back some of these proteins and some of those mm, attributes that you may be lacking in a wine later in life, pre-bottling, or as that wine ages, maybe gets a little too tannic. From oak aging, you want to add a little bit of body back to the wine um, so that you may rebalance. Um, there are tools like that that you can use that are um, based from that same concept, but it's a purified form um, that you can use ad hoc later in that wine's life. Very, very interesting stuff. Okay, so now that we have the best case happy-go-lucky scenario, what happens when a fermentation goes all wrong? And that's going to be a rarity, hopefully, but it does definitely happen. So there's a few different scenarios that you have to think about when a fermentation goes wrong. One, you have a fermentation that gets maybe it's not competing as well against all the uh, other microbes that are in there. So it's not winning the fight. And so there's multiple things eating sugar and eating the materials that are available from that fermentation in that wine scenario that they're all fighting for the same amount of material. And what can happen is you can have either, depending on the microbe, you can get anything from highly, highly reductive wines that can smell like rotten egg. They can smell like onions and garlic. You can have a wine that can smell like a wet barnyard or a dirty horse or um, a smoky cigar ashtray. You can have it smell like gross, fresh medicine out of a pill bottle. Um, there are even you can get very, very high acetic levels to where it smells like vinegar more than it does like a wine. in that fermentation. And those effects, depending on what they are, depending on how concentrated they are, affect what you can do with the wine. When, uh, well, there's one more scenario too. That wine could also, that fermentation can also die out in that wine, leaving a high amount of residual sugar in that wine that you didn't either intend to happen. Sometimes this is done purposely. Sometimes it's done because it's the best scenario. As you're watching that analysis and you're watching that sugar decrease over time, and it's supposed to go down all the way to the end, but it doesn't. It stays right here. That's not good. But maybe you can um, restart that fermentation using, again, a specialized strain of yeast that is very good at eating very little sugar with a high alcohol content to help complete that fermentation. Not a great scenario to be in. It can work. It can work well. It's more likely than not that that wine you can get it done, but that wine's never going to be to where it should have been because it'll pick up some um, other issues, whether it's it can get aldehydic or it can kind of get a nutty vibe. It can smell like sherry or oxidized apples. It can it can get even to like toasted almonds. Um, it can get pretty gnarly. You can also go the other way, where it can be even more vinegar than it does sweet wine. So you have to pick your poisons. Hopefully, you can do it right and maintain it and watch it and fix that problem before it becomes an even larger one. Always interesting, always difficult to figure out what you're going to do there. And then lastly, well, not lastly, but next you're going to be um, uh, looking at if these wines have a multitude of problems, like I foreshadowed on a second ago. Um, is that problem going to persist, or is it going to stop at some point? And how do I stop it? And you need to then identify who's doing it, because there are a multiple amount of bad characters or actors that can be doing that, and each one of these different species of yeast or fungus or bacteria have a different way to how you tackle them, whether it's through a chemical or physical removal. Most can be solved by looking at sulfur dioxide or some sort of sterilant chemical, or you have to then use a more physical attribute like filtration or um, pasteurization is not really a thing, but it would be an option if you had the tools to do it. Um, but filtration is going to be your main point to remove those things from there using very, very tight, non-porous filters that can maybe remove these bacterium or fungus from these microbes from the scenario. And there are filters that are tight enough to sterilize wine and not have a harsh attribute on the product, which is pretty cool. All right, so now we back to the happy side of the scenario. We got through our alcohol fermentation. We have a nice dry wine right where we want it. We have a good alcohol right where we want it. Um, uh, we have our wine racked off that gross, they call them gross lees or gross sediment that are in there. We have it mixing and stirring our um, we have it stirring that lightly, is giving some body and weight to the wine if we want. Um, and now what do we do with that wine? Well, we do with that wine what we do to most wines. We get them ready for aging. We get them ready for bottling. get them ready for sale one way or another. And then through that process, we are uh, checking and verifying that that wine is without trying to reduce those microbes. We needed their help up front, but we're done with them now. We want to get rid of them. So we're going to use methods to help clean and reduce the particulate matter, solids, and clarity of that wine to get it ready for bottle through either natural sedimentation and gravity, and or filtration is also a faster, more effective method of doing that over time. And all those are different quality dependent attributes that you um, want to think about when you're making wine. I want to make sure I did this properly when I was doing the side while I was talking. Because when I talk about this stuff, I think about stuff at work, and then I remember things I didn't think about. So I want to make sure I capture this before I forget, and I lose it forever. Let's make sure this is right. All right. So one last thing I want to touch on yeast is really where we're going from here. And one thing I've seen over at least my short tenure in the wine industry is um, they've worked very hard, always trying to create something new, something interesting, something that will create a new um, attribute that we can then use as winemakers. And I can only imagine as we get better and better understanding how to combine these different species or finding new strains of yeast from different areas that have a very interesting property, we might be able to better understand how to um, genetically modify, for lack of a better term, or genetically select the best attributes out of these, um, as long as they don't use the word genetically modify, but they would use other fancier terms, something like using terms like CRISPR or some of these other things that don't have the same thing, but they mean the same. That will one day maybe get to a point where all the quality of wine will always be enhanced because we've gotten to a point to where we built like straight up armored robots that can go in there and ferment these wines exactly how we want to the right point. They then know they won the battle, shred themselves apart, fight the mall cells to their death, and then give all their amazing attributes back to the wine in the best and fastest, most perfect way we want. Even looking at down the way, we can you do this through nanotechnology or help them through nanotechnology in the far future? Maybe. Not that this will be the first application of something like nanobots in something, but I can imagine one day we'll get bored enough and there'll be enough money and they'll be cheap enough to do, and it'll be 100 years from now and we'll be using little nanobots to help the yeast do their job better. That could definitely be a thing. Um, but at least in the short term, I can only imagine that these researchers that develop this, the producers that capitalize on it and produce them for sale, they will continue to broaden the spectrum of what yeast are available to use for different scenarios, and that'll only make better wine for you all, the consumers. So there's the world is your oyster when it comes to that, and I enjoy it. So that is fermentation in a nutshell. Thanks for tuning in. And we will switch this up and be right back.